The smell hit Detective Sarah Chen first on rain, wet earth, and beneath it all, something that made her throat close. Something wrong. She stood at the edge of the Columbia River Gorge, cobra wind cutting through her jacket, and stared at the tarp-covered shape 20 feet down the embankment. Behind her, the forensics van's engine ticked as it cooled. The sun was setting, turning the river below into liquid copper. "Detective," the young officer's voice cracked. He was pale, hadn't been able to keep his breakfast down. Sarah didn't answer. She was looking at something else. Something that had nothing to do with this scene, this body. This cold October evening in 2024, she was looking at a photograph that had arrived on her desk that morning in a manila envelope with no return address. Just a single Polaroid, its colors faded to that distinctive 70s amber. A young woman with dark hair and a nursing student's uniform, smiling outside a hospital. On the back, written in careful cursive, Susan Mitchell, Portland General, 1979. 45 years ago, and now, in the DNA lab 3 miles from where Sarah stood, a genetic genealogy match was processing. Results expected within the hour. What Sarah didn't know yet what nobody knew was that the name on that screen would destroy everything they thought they understood about the cold case that had haunted Portland for nearly half a century. The killer had been hiding in plain sight. He'd attended the vigils. He'd consoled the family. He'd helped search the woods where Susan's body was eventually found, and for 45 years, he'd slept peacefully, believing he'd gotten away with murder. The rain came down in sheets that November night in 1979. Susan Mitchell pushed through the hospital's side entrance at 11:47 p.m., her nursing student badge swinging from the lanyard around her neck. Her shift had run late surgery complication in the ER, all hands needed. She was exhausted, her feet aching in the white nursing shoes that were already starting to show wear after just 3 months of clinical rotations. She was 21 years old. She wanted to be a pediatric nurse. She loved children, loved the way they were brave even when they were scared, loved their resilience. Her mother still had the letters Susan had written when she was 12, declaring with absolute certainty that she would work with kids someday, that she would make a difference. 3 months into her clinical year at Portland General Hospital, Susan Mitchell was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had no way of knowing she had less than 2 hours to live. The parking lot stretched out before her, dark and slick with rain. The streetlights created halos in the mist. Susan clutched her canvas bag closer and started toward her Cara 1974 Chevy Nova. Powder blue, her father's high school graduation gift to her. She'd named it Betsy. What Susan didn't notice was the figure watching from the shadows near the emergency entrance. Watching and waiting. Patient, careful. She reached her car, fumbled for her keys. The rain was heavier now, soaking through her thin jacket. She was thinking about tomorrow's her anatomy exam, the study group meeting at 7. She was thinking about whether she had time to call her boyfriend, Mark, before she crashed. She was thinking about everything except danger. The keys slipped from her wet fingers. She bent to pick them up, and that's when she heard the footsteps behind her. "Need some help?" The voice was familiar, friendly, concerned. Susan turned, relief flooding through her. She recognized him, Charles Baker, one of the hospital security guards. He'd been there during her orientation, had walked her to her car once before when her shift ran late. He was older, maybe 50, with a kind face and a reputation for looking out for the nursing students. "Oh, Mr. Baker," she said, smiling. "You startled me. Didn't mean to." He stepped closer, his security guard uniform dark with rain. "Rough night to be heading home alone." "I'm just finishing my rounds. I can walk you to your car if you'd like. Make sure it starts okay in this weather." It was such a normal offer. Such a thoughtful gesture from a man everyone trusted. Susan never saw the rope in his pocket. "That's okay," she said, already unlocking her door. "I'm parked right here. But thank you, Mr. Baker. That's really nice of you." "Call me Charles," he said. And then, because he'd planned this moment for weeks, because he'd been watching her for months, because he knew exactly what he wanted to do, he added, "Actually, I'm glad I caught you. There's something I wanted to show you." In the loading area. "Something you might want to see." Susan hesitated, her hand on the car door. Rain ran down her face. "What is it?" One of the nurses left her purse. "Has your friend Jennifer's name in it? I figured you might know how to reach her. Jennifer Hartley, Susan's study partner. She'd mentioned that she'd lost her purse last week, had been searching everywhere for it. You found it." Susan's face lit up. "Oh my gosh, she's been so stressed about that. She had her ID, her credit cards, everything. It's just over here." Charles gestured toward the loading dock, hidden from view behind a row of maintenance vehicles. 2 seconds. Then you can get out of this rain." It was the kind of decision that takes less than a heartbeat to make. The kind that seems completely reasonable in the moment. The kind that changes everything. Susan Mitchell followed Charles Baker into the shadows. She never came back out. What nobody knew at the time was that Charles Baker had done this before. Not murder. Not yet, but he'd been practicing. Building up to it. For the past year, he'd followed women from the hospital parking lot, watching where they went, learning their routines. He'd broken into apartments, stood over sleeping women. Felt the power of being invisible, being in control. He was escalating, and Susan Mitchell, with her kind smile and trusting nature, had become his chosen one. The next morning, when Susan didn't show up for her anatomy exam, her study group figured she'd overslept. When she didn't answer her phone by noon, they started to worry. By evening, when her mother called the hospital and learned Susan had left her shift the night before, the worry turned to fear. By midnight on November 3, 1979, Susan Mitchell was officially missing. Her car was found in the hospital parking lot, locked, keys still in the ignition. Her canvas bag was on the passenger seat, her textbooks inside, her wallet untouched. Everything she needed to get home was there. Everything except Susan. Detective James Morrison got the call at 2 a.m. He was 43 years old, a 20-year veteran of the Portland Police Department. And he'd worked missing persons cases before. Young women who'd had fights with boyfriends and needed space. Runaways. Few that turned into something darker. Something in his gut told him this one was going to be dark. He arrived at the hospital as dawn was breaking. The sky the color of bruises. Susan's parents were already there, Linda and Robert Mitchell, clutching each other in the emergency room waiting area where their daughter had worked just hours before. Linda's face was swollen from crying. Robert's hands were shaking. "She wouldn't just leave," Linda kept saying. "Not without telling us." "Not Susan. She's responsible. She's careful." Morrison had heard this before. Every parent believed their child was different, special, careful. And maybe Susan Mitchell was all those things. But careful didn't matter when you crossed paths with someone who'd stopped caring about rules. "Tell me about her routine," Morrison said, pulling out his notebook. Everything about last night. They talked for an hour. Morrison learned that Susan was reliable, punctual, dedicated. She called her mother every Sunday. She never missed class. She'd been dating Mark Thompson for 2 years, and they were happy, no fights, no drama. She had a close circle of friends, no enemies, no stalkers that anyone knew about. She was, in every way, exactly the kind of person who shouldn't vanish. "We need to check the hospital," Morrison said. Everyone who worked last night. Everyone who might have seen her. It took 3 days to interview the entire night shift. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, maintenance staff. Everyone remembered Suzanne, the sweet nursing student with the bright smile. But nobody had seen her leave, except one person. Charles Baker, hospital security guard, 23 years on the job, married, father of 3, respected member of the community. He'd worked the night shift on November 2nd. He'd been doing his rounds when Susan left. "I saw her go to her car," he told Morrison, his face creased with concern. "Around midnight, maybe a little before. The rain was coming down hard. I asked if she needed help, but she said she was fine. I watched her get in and drive away. It was a lie. A smooth, practiced lie delivered with exactly the right amount of worry and helpfulness." Morrison wrote it down. He had no reason to doubt the security guard. Why would he? Charles Baker had passed every background check. He coached Little League. He volunteered at his church. His wife, Martha, was a schoolteacher. His daughters were honor students. He was exactly the kind of man you'd trust to protect your daughter. On November 7, 1979, 5 days after Susan Mitchell vanished, a hiker found something in the Columbia River Gorge. At first, he thought it was a pile of discarded clothes caught in the underbrush about 30 feet off the hiking trail. But as he got closer, pushing through the wet branches, he saw the hand pale, still, reaching up as if asking for help that would never come. Susan Mitchell had been strangled. The autopsy would later reveal that she'd fought hard. There was skin under her fingernails, bruising on her arms where she'd tried to defend herself. But whoever killed her had been stronger, determined, methodical. Her body had been carefully positioned, her hands folded across her chest. Almost peaceful, almost gentle, as if the killer had cared about her, even in death. It was a detail that would haunt Morrison for the rest of his career. The crime scene was processed meticulously. Every fiber, every print, every trace of evidence was collected, cataloged, stored. But this was 1979. DNA technology didn't exist yet. Genetic genealogy was science fiction. The best they had was blood typing and hope. They found nothing that could identify. The killer, Charles Baker, attended Susan's funeral. He stood in the back of the church, tears running down his face, and watched as Linda Mitchell sobbed over her daughter's closed casket. He'd brought flowers, white roses, Susan's favorites. He'd written a card, "Gone too soon. May you find peace." He shook Robert Mitchell's hand. He hugged Linda. He told them how sorry he was, how Susan had been such a bright light at the hospital. And then he went home to his family and slept soundly. The way he always did, Detective James Morrison worked the Susan Mitchell case for 18 months straight. He interviewed over 200 people. He followed every lead, chased every shadow, pursued every theory. Susan's boyfriend, Mark Thompson, was cleared after a solid alibi. He'd been at a study group with 6 witnesses. Susan's friends, her classmates, her professors, everyone was investigated. Everyone cleared. The hospital staff was scrutinized. Charles Baker was interviewed 3 more times. Each time, his story stayed consistent. Each time, Morrison found nothing suspicious. Baker was helpful, concerned, cooperative. He'd passed a polygraph test. His work schedule was verified. He had no connection to Susan beyond being a security guard who'd seen her around the hospital. Morrison had no reason to suspect him. The case generated media attention for months. Susan's face was everywhere: newspapers, local TV, bulletin boards. The FBI got involved, contributing resources and expertise. Tips poured in from across the country. Each one was followed up. Each one led nowhere. By the end of 1980, the Susan Mitchell case had gone cold. Morrison never gave up, but he had other cases, other victims who needed him. Susan's file joined dozens of others in the cold case storage room, a cardboard box containing photographs, evidence bags, interview transcripts, and one detective's failure to find justice. Linda and Robert Mitchell held a candlelight vigil every November 2nd. They never stopped hoping for answers. They never stopped grieving. And Charles Baker continued his life, continued his job, continued being the respected community member everyone believed him to be. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the skin cells under Susan's fingernails, carefully preserved in the evidence locker, were waiting. Waiting for technology to catch up. Waiting for science to evolve. Waiting to tell the truth. Detective James Morrison retired in 1999. The Susan Mitchell case still unsolved. He'd worked it as long as he could, but after 20 years, the leads had dried up. The evidence had been re-examined multiple times using new forensic techniques as they became available. Nothing ever changed. Linda Mitchell died in 2003, never knowing who killed her daughter. Robert followed her in 2009. They were buried on either side of Susan in Riverside Cemetery. A family reunited in death, separated by questions that had no answers. Charles Baker retired from Portland General Hospital in 2004. After 45 years of service, the hospital threw him a party. His co-workers gave him a gold watch. The hospital administrator made a speech about dedication and loyalty. Baker moved to a quiet suburb outside Portland, into a retirement community where nobody knew about the Susan Mitchell case, where nobody looked at him and thought, killer. He spent his days gardening, playing chess, attending church. His wife had passed away in 2010. His daughters visited regularly, bringing grandchildren who climbed into his lap and called him Papa. He was 70 years old. He'd gotten away with it, or so he thought. Detective Sarah Chen was 34 years old when she joined the Portland Police Department's cold case unit in January 2023. She'd grown up in Portland, the daughter of immigrants who'd built a life from nothing, who'd taught her that justice mattered, that truth mattered, that you never stopped fighting for what was right. She'd become a cop because she wanted to help people, wanted to solve puzzles, wanted to make a difference. Cold cases were her passion. The forgotten victims, the families still waiting for answers. The killers who thought time had saved them, these were the cases that kept her up at night. The cases that made her feel like the work mattered. The Susan Mitchell case landed on her desk in March 2024. It came with a note from her lieutenant. Old case. Very old victim's niece is asking questions. Take a look, see if there's anything new we can do. Sarah opened the box and found herself staring at a photograph of a young woman with dark eyes and a brilliant smile. Susan Mitchell frozen forever at 21. Full of potential that would never be realized. The file was thick, decades of investigation, hundreds of interviews, countless dead ends. Sarah spent a week reading through everything, making notes, creating timelines. She learned about Susan's life, her dreams, her family. She learned about Detective Morrison's exhaustive investigation. She learned about Charles Baker, the security guard who'd been one of the last people to see Susan alive, and then she saw something that made her sit up straight. In the evidence log, marked and cataloged, was a rape kit. Standard procedure for any homicide victim in 1979. It had been stored properly, kept in temperature-controlled conditions. And underneath someone's handwriting from 45 years ago, there was a note. Fingernail scrapings, possible skin cells from assailant. Blood type A positive. Sarah's heart started racing. DNA technology had evolved dramatically since 1979. But more importantly, genetic genealogy had revolutionized cold case investigation. The technique that had caught the Golden State Killer, that had solved dozens of decades-old cases, that had turned family history into the most powerful forensic tool in modern policing. She picked up the phone and called the crime lab. This is Detective Chen. I need to talk to someone about genetic genealogy testing. I have a case from 1979 with preserved fingernail scrapings. Can we extract DNA? The answer would change everything. Dr. Michael Torres had been working in forensic genetics for 15 years. He'd seen the field evolve from simple DNA profiling to the sophisticated genetic genealogy techniques that were now solving cases thought to be forever cold. When Sarah Chen walked into his lab with the Susan Mitchell evidence, he examined the fingernail scrapings with the careful attention of a man who understood what they represented. "This is well preserved," he said, peering through a microscope. "Whoever processed this evidence in 1979 did excellent work. The chain of custody is intact. We've got skin cells here. Definitely not the victims. Can you extract DNA?" Sarah asked. "I can try. It's degraded, obviously. 45 years old. But we've had success with older samples. The question is whether we'll get enough markers for a genetic genealogy search. How long? Give me 2 weeks for extraction and sequencing. Then, if we get a usable profile, I'll upload it to the genetic genealogy databases. After that," he shrugged, "could be days, could be months. Depends on whether our suspects' relatives have done ancestry DNA tests." Sarah nodded. She'd waited 45 years for this moment. She could wait 2 more weeks. What she didn't know was that somewhere in Charles Baker's family tree, 3 of his second cousins had submitted DNA to ancestry websites. They'd been curious about their heritage, interested in finding distant relatives. Excited to build family trees, they had no idea they were about to expose a killer. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on April 15, 2024. Sarah was at home. Had just gotten into bed after a long day reviewing other cold cases. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Dr. Torres's name lit up the screen. "We got a hit," he said, without preamble. "Strong match. The DNA from the fingernail scrapings links to a family tree. I've been building it out for the past 6 hours. Sarah, I think I have your killer." She was out of bed, pulling on clothes, heart pounding. "Who?" "The name I'm getting through the genealogy work is Charles Baker, age 70. Lives in Beaverton. And here's the thing, he worked at Portland General Hospital in 1979. He was a security guard." Sarah's blood ran cold. Charles Baker, the helpful security guard who'd seen Susan leave. The man who'd been interviewed multiple times. The man who'd passed a polygraph. The man who'd attended Susan's funeral. "You're sure?" she asked, already grabbing her keys. "DNA doesn't lie. The genetic genealogy puts him at the scene. The skin cells under the victim's fingernails are his." She scratched him when she fought back. Sarah was halfway to her car when the full weight of it hit her. For 45 years, Charles Baker had walked free. He'd lived his life, raised his family, enjoyed his retirement. He'd thought he was safe, but Susan Mitchell had marked him. She'd left evidence. She'd reached out from beyond death and written her killer's name in genetic code. Justice delayed, but not denied. "Get me a warrant," Sarah said. "I want to arrest him tonight." Charles Baker's house was a modest ranch-style home in a quiet Beaverton neighborhood. The lawn was neatly trimmed. American flag on the porch. A bird feeder hanging from the oak tree in the front yard. Sarah sat in her car across the street at 6 a.m. on April 16th, watching the house as the sun came up. She had backup to patrol units, a tactical team on standby. They were waiting for Baker to emerge, waiting for the right moment. At 6:45 a.m., the front door opened. Charles Baker stepped onto his porch, coffee mug in hand. He was 70 years old now, white-haired and slower than he'd been in 1979, but still vigorous. He wore khaki pants and a cardigan. He looked like someone's grandfather. He looked harmless. Sarah stepped out of her car. Charles Baker. He turned, squinting in the morning light. "Yes. Can I help you?" She held up her badge. "Detective Sarah Chen, Portland Police. I need you to come with me." For just a moment, just a fraction of a second, something flickered across Baker's face. Not surprise. Recognition, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for 45 years. "What's this about?" he asked, setting down his coffee mug with a steady hand. Susan Mitchell. And there it was. The confirmation Sarah needed. Because Baker didn't ask who Susan Mitchell was. He didn't look confused. He simply closed his eyes and nodded slowly, as if a weight he'd been carrying had finally been lifted. "I wondered when you'd come," he said quietly. Sarah felt her hands trembling as she pulled out the handcuffs. "Charles Baker, you're under arrest for the murder of Susan Mitchell. You have the right to remain silent." As she read him his rights, as the backup units moved in. As Baker's neighbors emerged from their houses to watch in shock and confusion. Sarah thought about Susan, about a 21-year-old nursing student who'd trusted the wrong person on a rainy November night, about a family who'd died without answers, about justice that had taken nearly half a century to arrive. Baker didn't resist. He went quietly, peacefully, as if he'd been expecting this all along. In the car on the way to the station, he finally spoke. "How did you find me?" Sarah met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "She left you a message. Under her fingernails. She fought back, and she marked you. DNA doesn't forget." Baker laughed a dry, hollow sound. "All these years, I thought I'd been careful. I washed my hands. I cleaned the scene. I thought I'd gotten away with it." "You did," Sarah said. "For 45 years. But not forever. Never forever." Charles Baker waived his right to an attorney. He wanted to talk, he said. He was tired of keeping secrets. In the interrogation room, with the cameras rolling and Sarah Chen sitting across from him, he told his story. Not with remorse. Not with guilt. With the detached tone of a man recounting something that had happened to someone else. "I'd been watching her for months," he said. "Susan, she was beautiful. Always smiling. Always kind. I used to imagine what it would be like to have that kind of goodness all to myself." Sarah kept her face neutral, professional. Inside, she was screaming. "That night, when she left her shift late, I saw my opportunity. I told her I'd found her friend's purse. She believed me. Why wouldn't she? I was security. I was safe." "Where did you take her?" Sarah asked. "The loading dock. There's a storage room back there, hardly ever used. I told her the purse was inside. When she went in ahead of me, He paused, as if searching for the right words. "I put my hands around her neck. She fought. God, she fought hard. She scratched my face, my arms, drew blood. But I was stronger." Sarah thought about the moment Susan Mitchell realized what was happening. The betrayal. The terror. The desperate fight for life. "Why?" she asked. "Why, Susan?" Baker looked at her with empty eyes. "Because I could. Because I wanted to know what it felt like. Because I'd been thinking about it for so long that it didn't feel real anymore. It felt like a fantasy. Until it wasn't, and after. I drove her to the gorge. Laid her out carefully. She looked peaceful. I wanted her to look peaceful." He said it as if he'd done Susan a favor, as if there was kindness in his violence. Sarah's hands clenched under the table. "Did you ever think about her family? About what you took from them?" "Every day," Baker said simply. "I went to her funeral. I saw her mother crying. I thought about confessing right then. But I didn't. I went home. I lived my life. I had children, grandchildren. I was happy. Isn't that terrible?" It was. It was so terrible that Sarah had to take a moment to compose herself. "You attended vigils," she said. "You helped search for her. You looked her parents in the eye and lied. I know. Why now? Why confess now? Baker leaned back in his chair. Because I'm 70 years old. Because I'm tired. Because maybe, deep down, I always knew this day would come. The guilt doesn't go away, detective. You just learn to live with it. Until you can't anymore. The confession was recorded, transcribed, signed. Everything needed for prosecution, as Baker was led back to his cell. Sarah stepped outside the police station and called Susan Mitchell's niece Jennifer, named after Susan's best friend. The woman who'd never known that her aunt's murder had begun with a lie about a missing purse. We got him, Sarah said. After 45 years, we got him. On the other end of the line. Jennifer Mitchell wept. The trial of Charles Baker began on September 15, 2024. In Multnomah County Circuit Court. The courtroom was packed. Media from across the country had descended on Portland to cover the Kaiser. 45-year-old murder solved by genetic genealogy. A trusted security guard revealed as a killer. A family finally getting answers. Susan Mitchell's surviving family members sat in the front row. Her younger brother, David, now 62 years old. Her niece Jennifer, 40. Cousins, friends. Former classmates, all of them there to witness. Justice for a woman who'd been gone longer than she'd been alive. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michelle Reeves, built their case methodically. They started with Susan's story, the bright, ambitious nursing student with her whole life ahead of her. They showed photographs of Susan laughing, studying, dreaming. They made her real, made her human, made the jury understand what had been stolen. Then they presented the evidence. Dr. Michael Torres took the stand and explained the science. DNA extraction from 45-year-old fingernail scrapings. Genetic genealogy. Family tree construction. The irrefutable genetic link between the skin cells found under Susan's nails and Charles Baker. The probability that this DNA belongs to someone other than the defendant, Dr. Torres said clearly, is 1 in 8 quadrillion. The jury listened intently as Detective Sarah Chen walked them through the investigation. The discovery of the preserved evidence. The decision to pursue genetic genealogy testing. The match. The arrest. Charles Baker had 45 years to disappear, Sarah testified. 45 years to destroy evidence, to flee, to cover his tracks. But he didn't, because he thought he'd gotten away with it. He thought time had saved him. She paused, looking directly at Baker, who sat impassively at the defense table. But time didn't save him. Science did. And Susan Mitchell did. By fighting back, by refusing to go quietly, she left us the evidence we needed to bring her killer to justice. The defense attorney, a public defender named Robert Hayes, did his best with an impossible case. He challenged the DNA evidence, questioned the genetic genealogy process, suggested contamination or misidentification, but the science was sound. The evidence was overwhelming. And Baker's own confession, played for the jury on video, sealed his fate. On October 28, 2024, 45 years and 1 day after Susan Mitchell's murder, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupted in applause and tears. David Mitchell collapsed into his daughter's arms, sobbing. Sarah Chen felt tears streaming down her own face and didn't bother to wipe them away. Charles Baker showed no emotion. He simply nodded, as if confirming something he'd always known. 2 weeks later, Charles Baker stood before Judge Patricia Dawson for sentencing. The victim impact statements were devastating. David Mitchell spoke first, his voice shaking but strong. My sister Susan was everything good in this world. She was kind. She was smart. She wanted to help people. She deserved to live a long, beautiful life. This man took that from her. He took her from us. And then he went home and lived the life that should have been hers. He turned to look at Baker directly. My parents died without knowing who killed their daughter. They died with that pain, that not knowing eating at them every single day. You took Susan from us twice, once when you murdered her, and again every day you stayed free while we suffered. Jennifer Mitchell spoke next, talking about growing up without the aunt she was named for. About the shadow Susan's murder had cast over her entire family. About the hope that had finally arrived with Sarah Chen's phone call. Justice delayed is still justice, she said. And today, finally, Susan can rest in peace. When it was over, Judge Dawson looked at Charles Baker with undisguised contempt. Mr. Baker, you exploited Susan Mitchell's trust. You used your position of authority to lure her to her death. You showed no mercy, no compassion. And for 45 years, you showed no remorse. You lived your life while she lay in a grave and her family lived in agony. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. May you spend whatever time you have left thinking about the life you stole and the pain you caused. Baker was led away in handcuffs. He would die in prison, likely within a few years given his age and health. But he would die knowing he'd been caught, exposed. Held accountable, Susan Mitchell had won in the end. 3 months after the trial, on a cold January morning in 2025, Sarah Chen stood at Susan Mitchell's grave in Riverside Cemetery. The headstone was simple: Susan Elizabeth Mitchell, 1958, 1979. Beloved daughter, sister, friend. Now and forever, an angel watching over us. Sarah placed a bouquet of white roses at the base of the stone. White roses, Susan's favorite. The same flowers Charles Baker had brought to her funeral 45 years ago. But these were different. These were from someone who'd actually given Susan justice. We did it, Sarah said softly. We got him. You can rest now. The wind picked up, rustling through the bare trees. Sarah pulled her coat tighter and thought about the journey that had led her here. The cold case box. The preserved evidence. The genetic genealogy match. The confession. The trial. Justice delayed, but never denied. She thought about all the other cases still waiting. All the other families still hoping. All the other victims who'd left evidence behind, waiting for science and determination to catch up. The Susan Mitchell case had opened doors. The publicity had generated tips on other cold cases. The success had inspired other detectives to take another look at old evidence, to try new techniques, to never give up. Already, 3 more cases in Oregon had been reopened with genetic genealogy testing. 1 had resulted in an arrest. 2 more were pending. Susan's death had been a tragedy. But her case had become a catalyst for change. A reminder that time doesn't erase guilt, and science doesn't forget. Sarah Chen sat in her office, reviewing the cold case files that had been submitted for genetic genealogy testing. There were 17 now, all waiting for lab processing, all representing families who'd waited years or decades for answers. Her phone rang. Dr. Torres, we got another hit, he said. The 1982 case. Rebecca Santos. DNA from the crime scene matches a suspect who's been dead for 10 years, but his brother is still alive and never knew what his sibling had done. Sarah grabbed her notebook. Tell me everything. As she listened, as she started building another case, another chance at justice, she glanced at the photograph on her desk. Susan Mitchell, smiling in her nursing student uniform. Frozen forever at 20-1. Next to it was a newer photo, Jennifer Mitchell and her family at the trial, holding a framed picture of Susan. 3 generations united in grief, and, finally, closure. Sarah had learned something important from the Susan Mitchell case. She'd learned that justice doesn't have an expiration date. that families never stop hoping. That evidence waits patiently for the right technology, the right detective, the right moment. She'd learned that every cold case deserves another look. Every victim deserves a voice. Every family deserves answers. And most importantly, she'd learned that the work matters. Every single day, it matters. The Susan Mitchell case changed more than just one family's life. In the wake of Baker's conviction, Portland General Hospital implemented new security protocols. Background checks became more rigorous. Mental health screenings became mandatory. Training on recognizing predatory behavior became standard. The hospital also established the Susan Mitchell Memorial, scholarship for nursing students, full ride program for young women pursuing pediatric nursing. The dream Susan never got to fulfill. The scholarship's first recipient in 2025 was a 21-year-old named Maria Lopez. She'd read about Susan's case, had been moved by the story, had decided to go into nursing to honor a woman she'd never met. Susan wanted to make a difference, Maria said at the scholarship ceremony. She wanted to help children. I'm going to do that for her. Her dream doesn't have to die just because she did. Linda and Robert Mitchell's graves, on either side of Susan's, got new plaques. Reunited with the daughter they never stopped loving. Justice found. Peace granted. Detective James Morrison, who'd worked the case initially and died in 2015 at age 79, is posthumously honored by the Portland Police Department. His name was added to the Cold Case Unit's wall of dedication, recognizing his tireless work on Susan's behalf. His widow, Margaret Morrison, attended the ceremony with tears streaming down her face. Jim never gave up on Susan, she said. Even when he retired, even when he was sick, he kept that case file at home. He kept hoping. I'm so glad he lived long enough to see DNA genealogy become possible. He believed it would change everything. He was right. 1 year after Charles Baker's conviction, Sarah Chen returned to Riverside Cemetery. It was November 2, 2025, exactly 46 years after Susan Mitchell's murder. The annual vigil, held by Susan's family every year since her death, was smaller now. David Mitchell was there, leaning heavily on a cane. Jennifer and her children. A handful of people who'd known Susan, who'd refused to forget. But there was something new this year, something that had never been there before. Peace. Thank you, David said to Sarah, gripping her hand with both of his. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for giving us answers. Thank you for making sure that man will die in prison. Sarah squeezed his hand. Susan made it possible. She fought back. She left evidence. She never gave up, so neither could I. As the sun set over Portland, turning the sky the same copper color it had been that night, Sarah stood at the Columbia River Gorge and looked at the DNA results. The small group lit candles around Susan's grave, one candle for every year she'd been gone. 46 flames flickering in the growing darkness. But this year, the darkness felt different, less oppressive, less permanent, because light always wins in the end. Truth always surfaces. Justice may be delayed, but it's never truly denied. Susan Mitchell had waited 45 years for her killer to be caught. Her family had waited 45 years for answers. Detective Morrison had worked until his retirement without solving the case, but the evidence had waited too. Patient, preserved, ready, and when the time was right. When science had evolved enough, when the right detective came along and asked the right questions, that evidence had spoken. It had said, Charles Baker. It had said, this is your killer. It had said, justice. At last, in her office late that night, Sarah Chen wrote her final report on the Susan Mitchell case. She detailed the investigation, the breakthrough, the arrest, the conviction. She made recommendations for other cold cases that might benefit from genetic genealogy testing, and at the end, Sri added a personal note. The Susan Mitchell case reminded me why I became a detective. It's not just about catching criminals or solving puzzles. It's about remembering that every victim was a real person with dreams and hopes and people who loved them. It's about refusing to let time erase their stories. It's about standing up and saying, "You mattered. Your life had value. And the person who took it from you will be held accountable." Susan Mitchell wanted to be a pediatric nurse. She wanted to help children. She wanted to make a difference. She never got the chance to do those things. But in death, she's made a difference in ways she never could have imagined. Her case has inspired other investigations. Her evidence has paved the way for new techniques. Her memory has become a symbol of hope for families who thought justice would never come. She was 21 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. Charles Baker stole that from her, but he couldn't steal her legacy. He couldn't erase her impact. He couldn't silence her voice. Susan Mitchell spoke from beyond the grave. She pointed the finger at her killer. She demanded justice, and justice finally was served. This case will stay with me forever. Not just as a professional victory, but as a reminder of why the work matters. Every cold case is someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's lost loved one. Every box in storage is a family's unanswered prayer. We owe it to them to never stop trying, to never give up, to keep pushing forward even when the odds seem impossible, even when decades have passed, even when it seems like justice will never come, because it will. Sooner or later, with persistence and science and a little bit of luck, justice always comes. Susan Mitchell's case proves it. And somewhere out there, there are other Susans. Other families waiting. Other killers who think they've gotten away with it. They're wrong. We're coming for them. With DNA, with determination, with the voices of victims who refuse to be silenced. Justice delayed is still justice, and we'll never, ever stop fighting for it. Charles Baker died in prison on March 15, 2027, at age 73. Heart failure, quick and relatively painless. His death made the news. Man who killed Susan Mitchell dies in prison, but the coverage was brief. Most people had moved on. Charles Baker was no longer interesting. He was just a killer who'd been caught. A monster who died behind bars where he belonged. His family didn't claim his body. His daughters had disowned him after the trial. His grandchildren were too young to remember him now, and their parents wanted to keep it that way. Charles Baker was cremated by the state, and his ashes disposed of without ceremony. No grave marker, no memorial, no legacy. He'd lived 73 years. He'd gotten 71 more years than Susan Mitchell. And in the end, he'd died forgotten and despised. Remembered only for the worst thing he'd ever done. Susan Mitchell, on the other hand, would never be forgotten. Her scholarship continued. Her case continued to inspire new investigations. Her family continued to visit her grave and tell stories about the bright, beautiful girl who'd wanted to help children at Riverside Cemetery. Fresh white roses appeared on her grave every November 2nd, sometimes from her family, sometimes from former nursing students at Portland General, sometimes from people who'd never met her but had been moved by her story, and sometimes from Sarah Chen, the detective who'd never known Susan in life but had come to know her in death, who'd fought for her, who'd given her justice on the headstone beneath Susan's name and dates. Someone had added a new inscription. It had been David Mitchell's idea, approved by the cemetery, carved carefully into the granite. She fought back. She left evidence. She got justice. A light that could never be extinguished. And beneath that, in smaller letters, her voice was never silenced. On a bright spring morning in 2028, a young nursing student named Emma Chun, no relation to Detective Sarah Chen, just a coincidence, stood in front of Portland General. hospital for her first day of clinical rotations. She was nervous, excited, terrified, all the things every nursing student feels on their first day. As she walked toward the entrance, she passed a memorial plaque she'd never noticed before. She stopped to read it. In memory of Susan Elizabeth Mitchell, 1958 to 1979. Nursing student. Her dream of helping children lives on through the nurses she inspired and the justice she achieved. May her light guide all who enter here. Emma didn't know the full story. She'd heard something about a cold case, a murder from decades ago, a killer finally caught. But standing there, reading Susan's name, seeing her own reflection in the polished brass plaque, she felt a connection. She was 21 years old. The same age Susan had been. She was starting her clinical rotations at the same hospital. She had the same dreams. "I'll do my best," Emma whispered to the plaque. "For both of us." And then she walked through the doors, into the hospital, into her future. Into a life that Susan Mitchell had paved the way for but never got to live herself. Behind her, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting light across the memorial plaque, making Susan's name gleam, somewhere in whatever comes after death. Perhaps Susan Mitchell was smiling. Her dream hadn't died with her. Her legacy lived on. Her voice had been heard, and justice, after 45 long years of darkness, had finally arrived in the light, in memory of all the cold case victims still waiting for justice, in honor of all the families still hoping for answers, in recognition of all the detectives who never give up, justice delayed but never denied.